Today I'm here to talk about some of my all-time favorite books over a wide variety of genres, and the theme tying them all together is that they're all going to be by authors who are Canadian. I'm going to let you in on a little dirty secret of my channel. A lot of people will leave comments saying that I'm great for finding hidden gems, and I suspect that a lot of those comments come from people who are outside of Canada, because usually what a lot of you are calling a hidden gem is actually just a Canadian book that maybe doesn't have as much international appeal. So again, I'm going to talk about a lot of my favorite books that again are just plain good books regardless of who they're written by, where they are written, but I think that they are really good for a lot of reasons, for encapsulating what it means to me to be Canadian, really sharing my experience, the experience of the generations past, and I have some great books to talk about with you all. Books I love, authors I love, and if you were just here for some good books, I got you covered. Let's get started. All right, let's start with horror. I'm going to rapid fire through some of these because a lot of these I've talked about before. First we have I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. This is a fantastic account of what it is like to go through the countryside of Canada, specifically on a cold, blistering winter day or winter night specifically, and I think it really captures that experience so well. It's haunting, it's dark, I love it. We also have books like Red X, which I recently talked about, which provides a perspective on Toronto, a very iconic and well-known city within our country, and I really love the author bringing in his own perspective, his own history and heritage as someone who is Ukrainian Canadian, and how that ties into his work as he blends the line between fact and fiction and breaks the fourth wall completely down. I love what he does here. We also have a book that is a great representation of Montreal. We have Coup de Grace by Sophia Adram. This is a story that is centered around Montreal, and then we have someone diving into the St. Lawrence in order to end their life. However, they end up in the subway system, and it's a great psychological piece that again captures Montreal, but also the literary brains of many of our authors and artists within our country. I think it is such a smart work, and I'm so proud to say it's Canadian. On top of that, we also have obvious ones like The Troop by Nick Cutter, which is a great story of a group of Boy Scouts who are camping out in the Prince Edward Island. So you have an idea of that countryside in Atlantic Canada, but also the horror element as things go horribly wrong, the usual content warnings for harm to animals, and also of course harm to small boys. And if you want more by this author, a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that he also writes under a pen name, or specifically that Nick Cutter is his pen name, and so you can also find him under his other author name, which I believe is his actual name, and that is the Saturday Night Ghost Club by Craig Davidson. And this is a literary coming-of-age story that very much has the framework of something of a horror story, but doesn't go to those really intense places. Instead is really about this young boy who is again ghost hunting with his family. Love it, and again I really think it allows the author to have his prose shine in a way that he doesn't always get to when he's writing under the Nick Cutter pen name. Now let's talk about science fiction, highlighting some of my personal favorites that also happen to be Canadian. First one being Spin by Robert Charles Wilson, one I've recently talked about. Again, The Stars Go Out at Night. This one is less specifically Canadian in how it is represented. The story is told throughout the world and beyond, but I think it is a great example of the wonderful hard science fiction work that is being done here in Canada and being published. So love this one. I think it is such a fantastic classic, and so happy to say that it's ours. And speaking of hard science fiction by brilliant authors, we then have Blind Sight by Peter Watts, another personal favorite of mine, involving first contact and themes of consciousness. It is a science fiction book with elements of horror, and again, while not as specifically Canadian in some of the setting of the story, I think it is great to again really uplift and show some of the brilliant minds that are coming out of our country. Then we have Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabashik Rice, which is a story of an indigenous reserve set at the beginning of an apocalypse. So you have the energy being shut off, so the power has gone out and everyone has to figure out what is happening and how to survive. It's a story of a community coming together in the face of this crisis, and I think it's just a beautiful story, beautifully told, and really captures again the indigenous experience of Canada, which is certainly not a monolith, but is a great individual example of this particular Ontario reserve. Then I want to loop back to an author I've mentioned before, but worth talking about again, and that is Foe by Ian Reid. This is a great story that captures rural American life as we follow a man and woman who are living in the empty countryside of our country, and there is a science fiction or speculative element that is brought into the story. But what I love is that it really again captures the isolation of life outside of the cities, which I think is an important part to capture, something I relate to quite a bit. So love this one. It is eerie, it is unsettling, and it is oh so Canadian. Next, let me rattle through a series of memoirs, the first one being An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth by Chris Hadfield, who is, of course, a very iconic Canadian astronaut who had the opportunity to work on the International Space Station, and this is his story, not just of his work up there, but really this very grounded Canadian-based story of the importance of hard work and determination. It is a story that is just relatable no matter who you are, so inspiring. Highly recommend the audiobook because you get his own narration to it, and I got the opportunity to hear him speak in person. Brilliant guy, so uplifting, such a wonderful, optimistic viewpoint in the world. I also want to mention This Bird's Choice by Ian Reid, and this is one of the memoirs that he has written that I adore, and this is one that just captures a particular generational life point where you have a young person who after college ended up moving back home to his family's rural farm to live with his parents, and it just is a perfect picture of what life can look like again in these smaller communities. The story is quiet. Honestly, nothing happens. His parents talk about food, they do farm chores, they talk about food again, they make food, they eat food, and they plan the next meal. It is so mundane that it probably doesn't sound very appetizing or interesting to those listening to this, but trust me, if you want to have that Canadian experience, there is something oh so Canadian about this one. And as someone who again has some similar background to the author here, definitely I can see again the Canadian aspect, what the author is trying to capture and relate in this story. And I think there is something really special about a quiet story like this. I also want to mention the memoir A House in the Sky by Amanda Lindhout, which follows a woman who was held captive for roughly 15 months in Somalia. Now, certainly this story, the majority of it takes place in Somalia where this person was working as a photojournalist. However, the reason I want to highlight it here, of course, the author is Canadian, but specifically the first section of the story talks about her growing up in small town Alberta in Western Canada, and I think it does a really great job of capturing what brought this person to go and travel the world, because often living in these smaller communities, the world just feels very small, and she felt this great sense of wanderlust. She wanted to explore and see the world because she was very aware of how small her life was in terms of what she had exposure to. Again, one I found so relatable, and again, I think really captures a part of the country that isn't otherwise represented in this list of books. And on top of that, it's a fantastic story of resilience, survival, which I think is a really key component to the Canadian experience. Then let's round out the video with some rapid fire of some other books I haven't got a chance to talk about yet. First up is Alias Grace, which is by Margaret Atwood. I'm sparing you from talking about The Handmaid's Tale again because I just talked about it. So instead, I'll recommend this historical Canadian piece that focuses on a servant who was potentially being prosecuted or convicted for the murder of the people who ran the house that she was taking care of. And it's a fantastic piece that is based off of real Canadian events, which whether or not you're Canadian or not, you probably haven't heard of unless you have read this book or watched the adaptation that was made from it. So it's a great piece, great mystery, again, a blend between different genres, and Margaret Atwood is fantastic. So again, if you don't feel like reading dystopian fiction right now, this is another great place to go, which is totally different, giving a good variety to Margaret Atwood's range as an author. I also want to quickly mention A Life of Pi by Yann Martel, which is the story of a young Indian boy who was going across the ocean with his family when there is a horrific shipwreck. He ends up getting stranded on a boat with several animals, including a tiger, and this follows his survival as he's trying to make his way to Canada. The story is told in the past, but also recounting his story to someone in the future, in the present day. And it's a beautiful story with themes of religion and belief, and I think it's a great example of the Canadian immigrant experience, which I do want to be inclusive to in this story. The author himself is not Indian, but really brings in an interesting conversation with that, and it's just a beautiful story with great imagery. Personal favorite of mine. I will use every excuse I can to plug this one. I also want to mention Essex Country by Jeff Lemire. Yes, the same author who wrote a lot of popular SFF graphic works like Descender. This one is just pure Canadiana. You follow a young boy who is growing up in this small community. There is references to hockey and small town life. It is just the perfect snapshot of Canada. Highly recommend this one. It is such a moving, emotional story. I also want to talk about Still Life by Louise Penny, the first book in a long-running series all about Inspector Gamache, and so it is typically set in this small Quebecois town, again giving that French-Canadian perspective to our part of the country. And this one always deals with themes of the darkness of humanity, but is also counterbalanced with the quaintness and coziness of this small French-Canadian life. So you have characters sitting around a fireplace, eating at a small bakery, and it's just such a good balance between being cozy and still having some serious things that the author has to say. Highly recommend this series. Again, it is so well done. The writing, the character work is just top-notch. Really recommend that. Finally, I want to talk about The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King, and this is a nonfiction account where the author examines both the Indian or Indigenous experience on both sides of the border, the US and Canada. I do want to acknowledge that the author himself was born in California in the US, but has since immigrated to Canada. And again, I want to be inclusive rather than exclusive of what counts as a Canadian author, because I think it's better to embrace more than to embrace less. And I think it's a great account that again brings a different perspective, talking about not just the actual history, but the inclusion in media and films and the different portrayals and the complicated, nuanced nature of trying to find reconciliation in our modern day. It is also incredibly funny. The author brings so much humor, which again I think is such a great representation of the wonderful Indigenous cultures that we are surrounded by, and I really love this one. It was such an entertaining read, but also a really harrowing read. Somehow the author found the right balance of having really serious subject matter and still making this book so enjoyable that you can't put it down, or at least that was my experience. So again, highly recommend it if you're interested in the topic. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd love to hear from you if you have a different Canadian book that you would recommend. Drop it in the comments. I'm sure other people watching this video would be interested to see more recommendations. If you want to support my channel, you can give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe, hit that little notification bell. But if you want to support Canada, whether you are inside or out, please consider supporting Canada by buying Canadian, propping us up in the news, calling your representatives, depending on where you live. And of course, hope you all are having a good day. Thank you so much. I will be back to my usual programming very shortly on Thursday, so thank you for being with me as I took a moment to talk a little bit more heavily about Canada and Canadian works than I normally do in my videos. But again, I'm just feeling very proud to be Canadian. I want to stay Canadian, and thank you all for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.